Welcome to a community conversation, the first of conversations that we may have like this, because I think this is going to be very helpful. I'm George Anderson. I am the senior minister here at Second Presbyterian Church. Andrea Boone is the producer for this program, and Doug Settles is working with the sound. Jim Leonard is also on mic. You don't see him, but you'll hear his voice from time to time because he'll ask a few questions that come in while we are having this conversation. Our guest is Dr. Kipper Nottingham. Thank you, Dr. Nottingham, for agreeing to have this conversation. I normally call you Kipper because we're friends, but I intentionally called you Dr. Kipper Nottingham because it's very important for this presentation for people to know that we are looking to a doctor for medical answers, that we're not getting into partisan divides or anything like that, but we're asking real questions that have to do with dealing with this pandemic and staying safe and what we're going to do when we emerge. I'll get right to it. Most of our questions that you'll be asked have come from the congregation. They've either submitted them in advance, or Jim might ask a few, or we'll ask a few that come in while we're talking. The first part of our conversation, I'd like to focus on the virus and its spread, and also about our how we behave right now. But then the second part of our conversation, I want to look at reemergence issues, that as we go back to business, as we go ease back into life as we had it, what is it that we need to be thinking about? What are the things that we can do to protect ourselves, and what are the dangers? What happens when we have gatherings of more than 10 people? So to begin with, I want to ask you a very basic question. I want you to describe this virus, what it is and how it spreads. Review the symptoms that people might have if they contract it, and what we can do to avoid catching it right now.
Well, interestingly, if you ask folks that came through medical school when I did several decades back, they would tell you that coronavirus is the virus that causes most of your colds in the wintertime. That's what most of us were familiar with. And there are a handful of coronaviruses that are pretty common. This particular one decided to do what viruses do on occasion, and that is it changed. And it changed in such a way that we're still trying to figure out, and as you flip on the news, you'll hear there's a lot of discussion about whether this had to do with poultry or bats or whatever. There are a lot of potential ways that this could have taken place, but in any event, the virus changed, and it became, in its change, able to be transmitted from animals or aviary to human beings. And the unfortunate thing is that this particular virus is a very contagious virus. As we look back over the last several hundred years, there have actually been reported probably 8 pandemics that have been through our history, some large, some small, and they think that this one is sort of acting the closest to the Spanish flu, which was 1917, 1918, when actually I lost my grandfather in that epidemic. So I'm kind of interested in this from that perspective as well. And what we have learned, though, is that the coronavirus, the COVID-19, and it has the 19 name because it was discovered basically, it surfaced in 2019. This particular virus has a longer incubation period than does influenza and do a lot of other viruses. The unfortunate thing associated with that is that you may catch this from somebody else, and typically it's done through droplets, and that is a cough, a sneeze, or droplets could be on a piece of paper that I could pick up and then transmit to a mucous membrane, my mouth, my nose, my eyes. It transmits so easily in that way, but we don't develop our symptoms for a longer period of time than we would with influenza. And for that reason, you can still share the virus with other people when you don't know it. People oftentimes have what we call asymptomatic spread, and that's to say that they are infected and they are sharing this virus with others and they're not aware of that. The virus manifested initially with the primary symptoms of cough and fever, and in many people, some discomfort in terms of their breathing, some element of respiratory distress or the sense that I can't get my breath very easily. Most coronaviruses we've seen in the past made your nose run. Influenza virus typically makes your nose run. This one doesn't usually make your nose run. And so we've tried to say, if I get symptoms in the wintertime, how would I know whether it's this or influenza? But that's a distinctive trait to this. Another trait that has surfaced is that many people will lose their sense of smell. And it's not forever. It's typically during the course that this virus runs, but a loss of a sense of smell and to some degree a sense of your taste. You can also have some nausea and vomiting, but the ones I mentioned at first are the big ones. And then one other biggie is that you often get a very profound sense of chilling. People say that I chatter so much that people have even been known to crack their teeth because they've chattered and chilled that much. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what this virus is about, I'll say.
And Doctor, I'd like to follow up on that. There's a lot of confusion about the period during which you are contagious and what it means to be presymptomatic and asymptomatic. Can you discuss that, please?
Sure. To be asymptomatic is to say that you are basically not having any symptoms. To be presymptomatic, we're saying that you are experiencing a problem before the symptoms actually come about. So during the time that you have been infected by somebody else, they've shared the germs with you, prior to your first symptoms, you're presymptomatic. Some people actually go through this virus the whole time and they're asymptomatic. That means they have no real symptoms during the whole time. That's often the case in younger individuals, but obviously it is a particularly tricky situation because we don't know who to test if they're not having symptoms.
Yeah, Jane asked a question that that connects with that. She asked if someone tests positive for COVID-19 but is asymptomatic, should they quarantine? And also, if the symptoms linger for 8 weeks, what is that all about? I mean, is that person still communicable?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear to us at this point that if somebody tests positive, that they are to be considered positive for this virus and they need to be absolutely quarantined. Doesn't mean they have to be in the hospital, and as a matter of fact, here in the Roanoke Valley, the vast majority of people who have had positive tests are able to go back home and quarantine on their own at home. The typical quarantine time has been about 2 weeks. That's sort of been the accepted average, if you will. What most employers and what the CDC has advised for getting back into the public situation, however, going back to work, going back to school, or whatever, if you have had a positive test, they want you to have 2 negative tests separated by 24 hours between them. So they want to be really sure that you're not still shedding virus. And it's tricky because you may have terrible symptoms and get sick and wind up in the hospital, or you may remain quarantined at home and have little or no symptoms and not feel bad. So it's hard for you on your own to determine that. There's been a lot of discussion about antibody tests. And you can barely pick up the paper or turn on the news. People aren't talking about all the tests that are out. But right now, the antibody tests that are out have not been very helpful for us. Number one, because the accuracy has been back and forth, not so good in a number of those. But the other thing is that having the antibody is no guarantee that you're not still shedding the virus and could be infectious to somebody else.
Yeah, and there's a question about if you have the virus, are you immune? Are you immune for a while? Are you immune for life? There's the hope that there's the herd, what do they?
Herd immunity.
Herd immunity. Could you speak to that,
Sure.
please?
The hope was early on that this virus would be like some viruses that we've seen in the past that convey immunity for your lifetime. For an example, chickenpox or mumps, measles. Those, once you get those, you won't get those illnesses again. What they have unfortunately found is that this virus does not seem to follow those same guidelines, if you will. And so what's happening is that your viral antibodies may go up, down, or sidewise. You may take a longer time in getting over the virus the first time around, or you may get reinfected, and we don't know for how long protection is actually offered to folks. The usual hope with these is if you don't get lifelong immunity, that you will at least get short-term immunity. And early on, they thought that we would at least buy a few months out of this, that we wouldn't be susceptible to getting it again. But there's some folks in the Asian countries in which obviously they were affected earlier than the rest of us. They have some data that are indicating that this is not very clear right now. So we don't know is the real answer.
Okay. Terry would like to know about the effect coronavirus would have on people with autoimmune disorders like type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis. Can you speak to that?
Sure. What we're finding is that this virus is not only more prevalent, but it's also more severe as we get older. So the first risk factor I would add to Terry's question is really our age. And I'm old enough to qualify to talk about this. But once we hit 50 and north, each decile, each 10-year period, our likelihood of having severe symptoms from this virus really goes up. And unfortunately, at the 85 and older denomination, it goes up extremely high. What we also find, though, is that certain illnesses may make us predisposed to more intense symptoms and complications, such as the very ones that were mentioned. A lot of chronic illnesses, even hypertension, and we're not really sure why that should be. Diabetes, very clearly the case. Rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and not only do those illnesses put you at higher risk, but oftentimes the medications that you may take for those illnesses may also affect your immune status and may place you at higher risk of having complication as well as getting the virus in the first place.
It might be good if you also talk about that people have hopes for a vaccine and they have hopes for a therapy that might render the vaccine not as necessary. Just speak to both those, what the difference is between them and what your hopes are about that. And timeline might be an interesting thing to address as well.
Sure. We talked a few minutes ago about the antibody test and the fact that they're out there and you can go probably in any given doctor's office right now and get some type of an antibody test. That doesn't really help us much with the treatment of you, but it may offer an idea of whether you have indeed been exposed to this virus, and if so, could you then donate your plasma, donate your blood, that then could be used to help treat somebody who is ill, particularly somebody who is very, very sick in the hospital. So treatment may be based upon, going down the road at least, may be based upon some of the plasma of people who've been infected. And there's a lot of research being done. We're having some right here in Roanoke that's participating with that right now. You've probably heard the medication remdesivir, which is an antiviral agent which had been used for a different viral problem some time ago and then kind of got put up on the shelf, has been pulled back and has shown some really good benefits in people who are particularly sick. I think what the experts are truly hoping, though, is that if they can be successful at seeing a vaccine fast-tracked, and again, you barely can turn on the nighttime news and not hear about what's happening in this respect. We're going through a time when making a good vaccine has really taken on a different flavor. And I say that because the pharmaceutical companies in the past have tried to decide, is it worth our time and our expense to do this? Well, fortunately, right now, everybody recognizes this is a pandemic. This has killed thousands of people worldwide and has the potential to keep doing that until we achieve immunity over a large period of, or a large group of the population. Herd immunity is the term that gets used, and typically it means that 60, 70% or maybe higher of a population has immunity and is not likely to get the virus either because they've had it and they become immune or because they can take the vaccine. But at this point, again, we have so many agencies, universities, the NIH, I can't think of all the different folks that are working on viruses in terms of trying to come up with a good type of vaccine. And what they're doing is that instead of getting Part A completed and going to Part B, getting Part B completed and going to Part C, they're actually doing a lot of these in parallel with the hope that if one or two of these may work out well for us, we've jumped ahead. We've made this a much shorter course than what we would have otherwise. It means a lot of work and a lot of money that will go for naught. That's going to happen. But the hope is that we're going to get a great outcome because of that. What I would say to folks is that as great as this is, and I want to see it happen and I want to see it work, we still have to remember that once we get the vaccine developed, we then have to figure out how do you mass produce it.
Right.
And we're talking mass production, I mean in a huge amount. And then you have to get that medicine out to the public. You have to produce it, you have to be able to give it to people, and then you have to wait some period of time before it takes effect. Pretty much everybody, I think, knows that if you get a flu shot in the fall, it doesn't really kick in for you for a couple of weeks. Well, we don't know how long it may take this vaccine before it becomes effective.
Yeah.
So that is why most of the experts that I've heard from, have indicated that first of the year, 2021, is kind of the bitter earliest that we can imagine having something out there.
Jim.
We have an online question from a different Jim. Where can you go to get tested? And I'll add in, do you need to be presenting symptoms to get tested in this area?
Testing questions have abounded, and the answer has changed almost daily. At this time, what I will tell you is you can actually go on, well, first of all, there's probably not a need to be tested unless you are symptomatic, if you have symptoms, if you've had an exposure and you're quite concerned that it was a significant exposure, or if you are about to join with people who you potentially could otherwise expose. If you're going back into a work environment where there's an issue, if you want to visit a loved one or someone who might be immunocompromised. So not just everybody has to be tested, and the health department has actually categorized who the highest risk folks are, because we haven't had enough tests. We had to figure out how do we kind of ration this. Fortunately, the amount of tests have now escalated significantly. The turnaround time has gone from greater than a week, which it was for the first lot of weeks in this here in the Roanoke Valley, to now being able to get things back pretty consistently in a day and a half or thereabouts. But if you go on the Virginia Department of Health's website, you actually can put in your zip code and it will tell you what the testing sites are in our area. So we have now a much easier way. Now, most of those are still requiring a physician's order to do testing. So I have read that Quest and LabCorp and some of the bigger companies may allow some people to self-test, but I've not tried it myself, and I understand here in the Roanoke Valley that a physician's order is still required in terms of doing that. Now, I will tell you, getting the order is probably not so tough. If you called your physician's office and said, I've had these symptoms or I've had this exposure, I think it's going to be pretty freely forthcoming that you would get that order.
That's good, because that's been a change. I know of others who found it very difficult, so that's good. We can shift a little bit to some behavior questions. Luann wanted to know about sharing food, wondering if the virus can lurk in foods. When preparing food in your home, is it okay to share with others, taking cookies or casseroles to friends and neighbors? And of course, the same question can be asked, is it safe to eat food given to you that's been prepared in other people's homes?
Sure. Luann's food would always be welcome in my house. I will say that this question got asked of a recently retired infectious disease specialist at VCU MCV, where I trained, and my son actually sent me a video of the retired infectious disease doctor being interviewed by one of the people that he had trained. And basically, he asked the professor, what do you do? How do you take care of things? And the food issue came up, both in terms of procuring your food and what's the safest way to get groceries and deal with it there in terms of how you get them into your house and what's safe, all the way through food preparation. And basically to share with you what he said, because he's a very trusted individual, he felt that the likelihood of contamination in most food was fairly low. He did advise that it's smart when you're bringing home fresh produce to go ahead and wash it in the sink. You don't have to do soap and water, but just water. Some folks, as we do in the Dominican Republic, some people actually put just a small amount of Clorox, of actually bleach in the water. And I'm not talking the amount that some of our political folks have discussed, but a very small quantity, a very, very small, like less than a quarter cup in a big thing of water to wash your fresh items. That probably is overkill, and actually water wash for those items is probably good. But the big thing is that cooking items seems to be something that the virus cannot stand up to. So if items are cooked that we should be safe, probably the bigger concern has been what is the food served in? And that's to say that if you have food, if we get takeout, did the guy who brought you the package and what it's wrapped in have clean hands? And so I would say to folks that I think that food that's been properly prepared, if you trust the cook in the kitchen, it should be fine, but it's good to think about how did it transport to us, and also the packaging and making sure that there's no issue there.
We had a number of questions about interacting with loved ones, which is growing more and more urgent the longer this goes on. Someone wanted to know about loved ones out of town. Maria, do you go to see them? Do you let them come see you? And someone else wanted to know about a close friend or family member not living in one's home, returning from a trip out of town. When they saw others, they stayed in a hotel, they handled the gas pumps. Should you limit visits with them to the outside and with all this separation? Talk about interacting with loved ones.
This is probably one of the most frequent questions I've heard from friends and neighbors, and not surprised to hear it today, as it pertains to essentially all of us. I think that the first thing you take a look at is what is my own susceptibility, both in terms of acquiring the virus and in terms of responding in a negative way if I should get the virus. And that's to say, am I at high risk? If I am somebody who has significant chronic illnesses, if I am somebody who is older, if I am somebody who lives with somebody who has those characteristics, then I'm at higher risk in terms of both acquiring the virus and having the virus do me harm should I get infected. So that raises my risk level. Secondly, though, I think that you look at your kids, and it hits our household like everybody else's. We have grandchildren who are out of town, and at the moment, those grandchildren are still able to go to a daycare setting. Well, in that circumstance, you have to think, okay, who are my loved ones getting exposed to? And if it turns out that they are in a daycare environment, or if you have a daughter-in-law who is a nurse on the front line somewhere, if you have folks that have potentially major exposures and you have potential illnesses yourself that might put you at risk, I think that it's time to stick with Facebook and to, FaceTime rather, and to try to have our get-togethers virtually. And that is distasteful and doesn't make me happy, but I think that's the reality of it for right now. I think we're going to learn something by our neighboring and other states through the Southeast particularly opening up some. And we're going to find out as states do open up what takes place. Do we see a big surge, a little surge, or just what? And that's going to help us to understand in Virginia, who has sort of been a little bit more conservative in this, how aggressive or non-aggressive that we should be. But I think that conservatism when it comes to potential exposures is really important. If you have somebody who has been traveling from away, who may have stopped at a rest stop or they couldn't have been in a restaurant, I don't guess. Well, in some states they could at this point. But if they've been in places where you're just not sure of who they may have come in contact with, the safest thing is to have them self-quarantine and have a distance between you until you can be confident that they're not going to come down with something.
Okay. Jim, do you have a question?
No, well, yes, I do, actually. Can you speak to sort of, I think a lot of people are finding themselves in a new mental health situation, and I know that's not your specialty, but we're experiencing a type of isolation I know I have myself, where things just don't feel right living the way we're living.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to interject here. You work with healthcare facilities, and this is particularly acute with the people we're trying to protect, the isolation from loved ones, and seeing people constantly with masks and where everybody looks the same. So divide that in two, because all of us are dealing with this, and then you might be more specific about those people and their situation.
I think it really gets back to how do we protect ourselves both physically and mentally. The physical part's kind of the easier one, so just to say a couple of things there while I'm thinking about it, and that is, it's really important that since we have all been locked down for these number of weeks, it's really important that we don't fail to take care of ourselves. We need to make sure that we get those colonoscopies and those skin lesions that you were worried about, to get those assessed and to get the mammogram and things like that we may have put on hold. Now that things are opening up and we're finding ways to take care of those procedures in a safe way. It's important to take your medicine. It's really important to get your immunizations. And of all the years that you should really get a flu shot, you probably should have been getting them every year anyway, but this is the year you really want to get your flu shot and your pneumonia shots, things like that, tetanus shots, to stay up to date with those. So that's the easy part, that's the physical part. The emotional part has been really telling, and as George said, I spend a lot of time each week in skilled nursing and long-term care facilities, and seeing our population there, most of them being older folks, but we have some younger folks as well, seeing them so isolated, seeing them not being able to be with their loved ones, having to, again, do FaceTime type of get-togethers when the staff can come forth to make that take place, has been a real challenge. And I would say, I think it's so important for us to find ways to get ourselves out of the house. And that's to say, taking a walk. I think I've seen more neighbors walking in the last couple of weeks at least than I ever have before, and it's terrific. We're keeping our distance, but getting ourselves out, trying to be physically active to help our mental health, trying to turn the news off from time to time. We can turn things on and just get blasted with one thing right after the other, and after a while, you really need to turn that off, and let's think some better thoughts and have some other things going on. And I think it's really important that you combine those with exercise, good eating. Unfortunately, in the last 6 weeks, ice cream and chocolate chip cookies have become sort of a staple for most of us, and I think it's time to say, okay, let's go back and try to do healthier things. And as a physician, I'd like to promote that anyway, but this is a particularly important time that we say, all right, if we can pull those together, they actually help support our mental health as well. I'll throw one more out, and that's to say, I see so many people who are isolated. I see neighbors who don't get out very much. I see folks who don't have loved ones close by. I think it's not a bad time to, I'll say, adopt a friend. And that's to say, if you have somebody that you know that may not be able to get to the grocery or have a communication with loved ones, this is a great time to pick up that person and say, you know what, I'm going to try to do something. Doesn't have to be in person. It may be calling them. It may be sending them a letter. It may be getting their groceries. But for us to do that helps stabilize our mental health as well.
I got the indication we need to turn to community opening up, but I hate not to ask the one question that several people asked about their grandchildren. I've got a grandchild at home, and right now I'm grateful because we get to cuddle and hug and whatnot. I have some of course, if you're a grandparent, you're in the at-risk category who want to know about handling their grandchildren. And, you know, people, it's getting old visiting through storm doors with no hugs and kisses, and they just wonder what you can say. And then we got to quickly move to the community one.
Well, just quick on the grandchildren. Again, I'm feeling for you because we're in the same boat. I think right now we know that those close personal hugs, those kisses, those which we all love in that respect, are unfortunately the best ways to transmit this virus. And so if you have a situation where you either have a family member who's close and in your household pretty much all the time, what I would look at is to say, make sure that that person doesn't have a lot of other exposures. You know, if somebody is going to a daycare or seeing multiple babysitters or having a lot of exposures, that's a direct threat to you. And so I would just ask that folks give great consideration to having a little lockdown time. If you say, I want to see grandchildren, maybe having even 5 or 7 days of those folks self-quarantining before we get together. And I've heard of different ways of doing it. I'll tell you as an example, one of our local hospitals that's opening up their elective surgery, they're having folks self-quarantine for a number of days before they get the elective surgery. I think the same thing goes for handling relationships with our grandchildren, as much as we hate to ask that of them.
Thank you. And that's one of those tensions because children need interaction to be healthy, and yet interaction puts the grandparents particularly at risk. Moving then to opening up, what's your opinion about opening up schools in the fall, and how are they going to practice social distancing then? And I have the same question about the church. And we've talked about the church too, because you and I are working together on a group that's studying this in terms of how we emerge. Schools and churches.
Right. I'm thankful that I'm not the administrator that's tackling that for schools and universities.
Thanks a lot.
Because it's fortunately our sanctuary is a little smaller, but no, it's a huge challenge to do that. We recognize we're going to have to do this. We're going to have to get folks back together, but we are going to have to make sure that we continue this masking, which nobody likes, but as I don't believe we've talked about today, I've talked about with a lot of other folks, the mask that we wear when we're out, which we're encouraging everybody to still use, it is more to protect the other people around you. It will offer you some protection, but it is more to protect the other people around you. When I'm up here chatting, I am sending some droplets out. And so we just have to be careful that we have a distance between us. That's why we're not wearing masks. We have the distance. But if you're not at that magic distance, you need to have the mask on. I think it's going to be critical for our schools and other organizations to make sure that we have means to keep people spaced. They simply can't do elbow-to-elbow work. And it's going to be the most unnatural thing. I don't think we're so bent up that we want to defy the rule. I think that a lot of this just goes against nature, and that it's like, oh my gosh, I forgot my mask, and I forgot that I'm sitting that close to you. We're used to doing those things, and we have to constantly remind each other, and we're going to have to do it in a kindly way, and it's going to be a terrific onus upon our teachers and other folks. But I think that's what's going to make it work. I think we'll see sort of a dry run as we open up restaurants and barbershops and other places, hopefully in the next week and a half or thereabouts, if that works out okay, and see how people do with that. But for instance, coming to church, we will probably for once, not want a full house and not even want a half-full house. We're going to want to have selected folks, and we're probably going to have to sit in a different pew than what we're accustomed to doing, and we're going to have to keep our distance. But those are things we're going to get used to, because I think we're going to be doing this for a little while.
And I think that just prepares everybody, because we could spend a whole hour talking about details and this and that, but it just prepares that we're going to have to do this thoughtfully and with safety in mind, but also, we're just going to have to do it with a lot of details thought through. Jim, you had a question?
This one's back to the medical side. What are your thoughts about diabetics being high risk?
I don't think anybody in the medical profession would tell you that a diabetic is not at high risk. And even if your diabetes is controlled, and actually there was something I read this very week saying the better your diabetes is controlled, it really does lower your risk in terms of the severity of illness if you get COVID-19. Interesting to know, and just one study out on that. But in any event, a diabetic, unfortunately, even well controlled, still is at higher risk than somebody who doesn't have diabetes.
I have a question that kind of goes back to church, but other things. Pam wanted to know, when can we start volunteering again? When can we tutor at the Presbyterian Community Center? When can we help host families in danger of homelessness? When can people be sitting at the front desk here? But it also goes to volunteering with places like the arts organizations and other things that people are involved in. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I think that, again, it gets back to, first of all, look at yourself and say, what are your risk factors? If your risk factors are significant, if you're 78 years old and say you have one chronic disease, then I would not want you on the front lines of the rescue mission, where you might come in contact with folks that have had, unfortunately, a shaky health history, or they may not have been able to protect themselves. On the other hand, if you have a volunteer activity in which you can do something safely, if you're at a front desk where you can be kept away from folks, the usual distance, if you have the situation where you can control the environment that you're in, say delivering Meals on Wheels or something like that, where you can take the food out to somebody, put the food down, wave at the person behind the door, and get back in your car, that's something that we should be able to do really anytime. So I think it looks at where you are in terms of your safety, and then the safety of the environment in which you're going to be placed.
Jim?
We have another online question. You're talking about the social distancing and wearing of masks. It sounds like it might be somewhat permanent. The question is, might this even continue after a cure or vaccine is available?
It's interesting. I think for anybody who has flown in the last probably 5 years, our friends of Asian background have been used to wearing masks for a long time. And typically, if you go in an airport, we fly periodically to Seattle to visit one of our kids. And if you fly out in that direction, there are a lot more Asian travelers that you see, and they have been used to using masks. It's just part of their culture that they do that. The rest of us have not been so good about that. I think that you're going to see folks, at least with the need to do that, for an indefinite period of time. There has been, I think before we started, we had a slight bit of conversation about, how long could this stuff really go on? And the University of Minnesota released something from their infectious disease department this last week that basically said 18 to 24 months would not be a surprise. And so as distasteful as that is to think of, oh my goodness, I'm going to change on my ways for this long period of time, we may be looking at needing to wear a mask unless we are successful in getting immunity from a great vaccine.
I'm really hopeful that they develop the therapies, and I'm clinging to that as Dr. Anderson. Of course, it's doctor of ministry, not of medicine, but for what that's worth, I'm hoping,
it's
because we all would love for it not to last that long, but we have to be prepared, absolutely.
Yeah.
This question is from Bill, who is also in the medical profession. And it's an interesting question because it assumes that the herd immunity would work. Now, this individual is older, and so he says, well, how are elderly to think about this idea that if we let it go on through, that we open up, it will increase infections and number of deaths will increase. Maybe it's necessary for the working of the world, we have to go on with life, but what does that do to like the 75-year-old who has to decide, do they just live and risk being part of the 70% that then can survive and then maybe has the immunity, and that's, I know that's an assumption, and then secondly, or do they just have to behave like this, being absolutely sequestered for indefinitely? I thought it was a very heartfelt question.
It's a great question that an awful lot of folks are thinking about. I think one of the sites that's going to give us information about this, develop insight, will be the country of Sweden, because most of you have probably heard that the Swedish folks have chosen not to be as aggressive with their locking down. They look at the folks at higher risk and they really encourage those folks to do what we are telling everybody to do here. But the rest of the population, they're pretty much saying, use your good judgment, go out, do what you think is okay. And so they're not having anything like the lockdown that we have encouraged. What's going to happen to that population? Are they going to develop this big herd immunity? That is to say, are all these people going to get immune, and do they stay immune? We still don't know that. Well, the answer is we sure don't know just yet. But I would say that for right now, I think the risk to our older individuals and to the folks with other comorbidities, which is you have other chronic infections, but particularly our older individuals, when you look at the curve, our risks are so high that I would not be comfortable in just saying, oh gosh, let's just throw away the mask and go out and go back to the restaurants and do what we want. I think that the risks are so high, we would wind up being like a New York. We're in an interesting situation here in Roanoke and in a lot of places that have not seen the severity of illness that some of these other places have. And when you talk to folks who have been in the thick of it, and particularly New York City of all places, it is so horrendous that I think it makes it difficult for us to appreciate just how awful this has been and could be. The good news is we have been behaving ourselves. We've been following the rules pretty well, and consequently, we've kept the numbers down and we've done well. But just remember, I peeked at the VDH website this morning, and the curve, we keep talking about flattening the curve, but the curve of infections is just now trying to flatten. And that's to say, it's not going down. It just means that we're not escalating. And that's still a pretty scary thing and tells me that we need to be follow these precautions.
Tell me about the medical strategy of testing. From what I've read, Australia, for instance, was incredibly aggressive in isolating and then testing, and therefore they haven't had nearly the cases. With the idea that being that if we have enough tests and if it was prevalent, that we could identify hot spots, and by identifying hot spots, then life could resume where it is not hot. But the idea being that testing is the means to do that. Is there? No. What's your opinion about that approach?
Testing is a super timely question, because when you look at the data, Virginia ranks almost at the bottom in terms of testing. Our numbers for testing have been very poor, and early on it was because nobody could get the test. You just didn't have the test available. And the tests that you had took forever to come back. They took greater than a week. So a lot of folks said, if you have the symptoms, go home and self-isolate, because we don't know how we're going to get you tested and blah, blah. In any event, at this point, better testing is what everybody is saying is going to help us. But that's, I think, predicated upon if you get the test, you're going to have folks who are willing to follow the rules, which is to go home and self-isolate, and you have good contact tracing. And that's one of the critical things that, again, in Virginia, we have a force of epidemiology colleagues who go out and they ask, who have you been around? Who have you potentially exposed? Who exposed you? What kind of work environment are you in? Do you work in a poultry processing plant? That sort of thing. we have to make sure that if we do the testing, we have something built in to trace down and make sure that we're getting all those folks sequestered and keeping them in safe places. So I think testing is super important, but it comes with those caveats that you have to follow that through.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think we're winding down to a close here. Is there anything that you haven't been asked, or anything that you would like to share right now that you think is really important to get out there?
I think that there is an awful lot of information available to the public right now. And what I would tell you is going in and having your consultation with Dr. Google can be a trying and sometimes frightening experience. I would just suggest to folks that to try to get the best information that you can, I look at the CDC website, cdc.gov. I look at the Virginia Department of Health, vdh.virginia.gov. The governor, Northam in Virginia, does a news conference on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 2 p.m., and it's on all the public TV and the other news stations interrupt. And actually, it's kind of interesting that his news conference often gives a lot more information than what you pick up in the news media. So I would just say it's been helpful to me to listen to him and to see what he has to say and the people that support him. But I think that trying to get adequate and accurate information is important. There's a lot of stuff out there. There are a lot of studies that are being done that at some point may be looked at as kind of junk science. And so sorting that out has been a challenge. And we really look to leadership in terms of our universities and elsewhere to guide us. So you also might be interested in the Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, and Cleveland Clinic websites also as good sources for information if you're looking for that.
That is so important. I mean, there's so much that's out there that goes through the prism of an agenda, which is just the way the world works, and particularly kind of in the political debates or whatnot. But I think everybody really wants to, before, all that's important enough, we got to end up voting and all that kind of thing. But everybody wants medical and scientific information and then base everything off of that. So finding those sources that don't have access to grind or don't have to have another kind of agenda at work, as much as that is possible, is so important, I think.
Exactly.
I appreciate it. Boy, that was a great way to end up. I'll say, too, as a Presbyterian, it's in the Presbyterian tradition that we've always been a faith of the mind as well as the heart and spirit, and science has always been a friend and a conversation partner for those who are in the Reformed tradition, I think, the classic Reformed tradition. I think this is an example of the fact that it is very important that we understand what smart people like you and other researchers and people in the medical field have to tell us. And of course, there are moral and ethical and social dimensions to this, and that's great fodder for conversation down the road, but already has kind of crept in because your compassion has come through. And I want to thank you for this, and I want to thank you for the work that you're doing in the healthcare facilities that you're working, because I know you do it with great expertise and compassion. And by thanking you, I hope I am thanking all the medical professionals out there who are doing their very best to protect us, and I'm grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate all those who are live. I appreciate all those in the future who will look at this online. I hope this has been helpful. If you would like to have other conversations like this, let us know, and I appreciate your giving us your time.